Hello. So let me go ahead and start here. So thanks for joining everyone, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mohammed Qasim. I think most of you know him from eFabless, but Mohammed's going to be taking over leadership of the analog work group, which I'm excited to announce to folks. And I think that's a great step forward to help us move the group forward. I think there's a lot of challenges in the analog front. I know there's a lot of interest in terms of doing some open source collaborative work on design. And we've had some great presentations on different research efforts in analog tools. I know Professor Stein from Oklahoma has a presentation to share on their experience with the Sky 130 PDK and doing that design work. But with that, let me introduce Mohammed and let you take over, Mohammed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. And actually, it's a pleasure to be a part of that forum. And I just wanted to express that my passion for this goes a long way back. I used to work with Texas Instruments at the Wireless Analog Technology Center. I was responsible, interestingly enough, from the year 2000 to the year 2011 on bringing advanced analog on when 180 was advanced in year 2000 and when 20 was advanced in year 2010. So I had the pleasure to be a part of that team. Working with TI was very interesting because they had their own technology and they developed their own specifications for the process. So I had the pleasure also of being a part of the mill that defines the components, like even transistors, new transistors for analog or things like that. This is a luxury that I don't know if we're ever going to have this again, but it was something that's amazing to be side by side working with the process teams and the EDA teams, as well as the SOC teams. So my background goes a long way in analog, especially on the CMOS. During that period of 10 years of TI, we had to automate. We had to, because of we were working on the first group of designs on the technology. So any given technology that TI came up with, before the rules are stable, before the models are actually realistically accurate, we would have to come up with designs that work so we can characterize them and feed back that characterization into the models and or the prediction system, the models, the simulation, etc., the simulators, and then refine. So you get a lot of experience. Obviously, this is something that probably all of you will relate to. You've done something like that in the past, or still doing it. So we had to automate because we can't just. They change the model, they change something. In the uncertain environment, there is something. But the automation was always verticalized and targeted. There was no generic automation. And that brought me to a lot of exposure to even the companies that had the automation back then, in the market. The second part of my life is the eFabless, and eFabless is founded principally to democratize basically chip design, and in general chip design. And it has a marketplace that intended to be similar to the Apple App Store, where designers can design and share their designs at any level, circuits or IP or SoC, with a customer and pay for it. And then that actually doesn't reflect the current reality of the world right now. Is that so the company now, the individuals or the App Store works with companies. So we have individual companies that actually act as entities, as inside the marketplace, and they can do design services, they can develop something new. And all our EDA infrastructure, when we started the company, we wanted to give them an SDK, an environment that they can design. And when we give them that environment, in order to be affordable and possible, it had to be open source. So we developed a complete, that was in 2014. We put together a complete analog and mixed signal flow, and mixed signal, and also digital flow. Back before the open road, it used to be called QFlow. And we developed several chips for customers using only open source EDA. And because of that, when we started publishing that in different forums in the CHIPS Alliance and RISC-V workshops and other conferences, people like Google started noticing that it is possible that you can develop a chip from A to Z with open source EDA. And so we're not an EDA company, but at the same time, we're not competing with EDA companies, because EDA companies came to us later and say, I want to put my tools aside, side by side to the open source tools, because it potentially can sell my tools. However, that's a side effect. But we have a lot of experience with open source, with creating commercial chips with open source EDA, analog or digital. And this was the pleasure, this was the passion that I had for the last few years, is to build a platform like this until the Skywater process. I was actually part of the push for it. So I was working closely with Tim Ansel until Tim Ansel got the money and from Google. And then now we're working with Skywater with the open source PDK, but we also have global foundries. That's not open source, but we have global foundries and we have XFAB. So I had the pleasure or the luck to be a part of a lot of learning in both worlds, the open source and advanced, so-called advanced proprietary, back in TI days. So I've been following and looking at the people in this group, at least with passion, and I'm always curious about knowing more, but I wanted to be a better contributor rather than just watching.
So thanks, Mohammed. So any thoughts? I think it's, we're at a point, about chatting about where, the group should go and, maybe some goals and some different collaboration topics. I know you mentioned some about the Sky 130 PDK, and go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't have a formal or anything to display yet, at least, but let me say the following, is that if we look at the world we're in, there is the semiconductor world is not by default an open source world. So we were just having a call earlier, and basically it's characterized by silos and people doing the same thing in parallel everywhere inside the companies, and the collaboration is not encouraged in general, except through watching papers or things like that without divulging a lot of it. So there is a component here that we're trying to solve a problem, or for in a world that is used to something else. Okay, the CHIPS Alliance, being a part of the Linux Foundation, is seated in the right place because it's Linux Foundation, with the objective of providing resources, open source resources, to build chips. If we say chips, in my opinion, to get the world to move around, you need to bridge all the way to showing that there is a chip that actually someone solved the real problem with it. And we have an example like a chip called Raven. Raven was actually used by NEC to develop a security processor, coprocessor. And that chip, they used it to define a new chip. So we developed a new chip, and NEC in that case wanted an open source chip for security reasons. Simple. And so there are new trends on that, so that can help us. The CHIPS Alliance needs to put out lead in that case, because I think it should be leading based on the mission, or even the definition of the CHIPS Alliance, the abbreviation. Then we need to start putting some soft, I said before, roadmaps. I don't want it to be a business. I wouldn't want it to be a business. We wouldn't want it to be directly a business, even though eFabless is a business. But I believe in the innovation needs to be seeded, but not tightly guided. It needs to be divergent, and it allows people to collaborate. So I see that we should be able to, with automation or not, build a set of building blocks that will be highly used to create open source chips. So I would want to, some people say SerDes, some people say, DDR controllers, or I say also, actually, even sometimes before that or in parallel, data converters, reference circuits, housekeeping IEP, power management. There are different things that you actually to make something useful. So if you build a SerDes today, it's a good contribution. Thank you. And we would do that, but that's not only that it would be useful in a specific area, which is great. But I think looking at the group here and the capabilities of the CHIPS Alliance and the members of the CHIPS Alliance, we should be able to come up with I'm not going to say that I know that roadmap 100%. I'm just using examples. So I would want to collaboratively put it together and then have thoughts from you, and we can pull on resources outside us, companies or individuals, and try to within, let's say, right now we're September in 2021. Let's say within a year we would have a couple of things that are introduced in the open source and widely used by the open source community. So that would be, I didn't say what they are because I think that's a subject to our discussion. And it's going to be a learning experience mostly for me.
I think learning experiences are good, and I think that's true for all of us. So thank you for your comments. So one of the things I had listed, I think back to the initial meeting that we had quite a while back now, which you had articulated at the time, what really was creating like I call it a collaborative roadmap straw man, or a soft roadmap, right, of trying to establish some goals for the group. As I said at the opening, we've had a number of presentations on some of the work being done in research on automating analog, and I think that's a great opportunity for different participants. But maybe we open it up for conversation here about some different ideas for a soft roadmap. And I'm taking notes here, but just some things that I had listed down. Some thoughts. One is to talk about industrial challenges, analog design methodology and EDA tooling, user challenges, methodology sharing, best practices. That could of course vary based upon the methodology by block type. Circuits, you mentioned this a bit about having figure of merit test cases. Universities generally have pretty strong test cases in that space, or different types of benchmarking that could be seeded. Could be an IP.
I'm taking notes.
Oh, all right. Sorry, I could just share this. An idea also was, maybe like an IP catalog or collaboration areas. We already mentioned a bit about, a DDR type controller, which, I know there is some interest in the community on this, and that could either be done, say, in an open PDK, which there's, a number of supporters in that idea. But depending upon the objectives of the block or the performance of the block, GF12 might be of a better interest or choice for that,
sure.
Right? Let's see here. So
let me just stimulate the thought just with a visual. I found the visual.
Ah, good. Okay.
So basically, and it's not confidential or anything. Just obviously it's an old slide. You can see it. But this was an example of something of this. These are representatives of what's in the market in a very loose way. What is needed. The memories, the interfaces, the analog in general, wireless. And so, if we take this and start crossing things and say, okay, or either what I'd like to suggest is that we would have a working version of this to define the areas that should exist. Okay, probably software IP should be somewhere here too for system, because obviously this is a very old 2015 slides. There is so we can use that, start using that as an initial seed, and then build on it and with different components. We also should tap into the world is that like, for example, things like open cores. you know, they actually, they're under represented and underestimated, because when you look at there's they have thousands of members. I think 300,000 members. So it's a community but it's a digital based mostly. But you know, we can leverage some of that into our analog, you know, discussions, and you know, if needed. But there's digital mostly. So if you think about something like this in the analog world, where we have more, and then the other thing is, I think that the analog mixed signal needs to be something like really, if we wanted to make it easily usable, it needs to be interfaceable to a digital world, and with wrappers and things like that. So there are multiple things that we can talk about. So I'd like to pull back now and then just come back to the same picture that picture that I shared with the and say, you know, whether automated or not first to start, and then automation comes into layers in this. You can start on the right hand side here. There are different levels of automation. Of course, depends on the node. I do also believe that there is a concept of an open source IP, but it's not built on an open source process, even if it's analog. So I think that also can be possible. We can build an open source IP on 12 nanometer, but we don't have to publish the GDS because we can't. But we can publish schematics, for example. You know, and so, and maybe, you know, certain views of the layout, you know, stuff like this. So I'll stop again. Just that the visual here needs to be representative of different classes of chips and different applications.
May I comment here?
Yes, please, Christoph. Thank you.
So I agree to all with what you say. So to have a soft roadmap of IP building blocks in analog, this will be very helpful. What I believe is a prerequisite is to have a common understanding about the methodology. So also to have a roadmap about a kind of standard that we all can agree on, that links all together. Because if we don't have this, and today we don't have it, at least I don't see it. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are working on it since many years, but usually what I see are point solutions, and there are good ones and not so good ones. And my expectation to this working group would be, or my wish would be, that we find a way to agree all on a kind of framework that is as open as possible, but as close as is needed to support this idea that all companies and universities can do a development and also exchange things. So in digital, it's much easier. They already have this kind of standard, and you are all aware they have Verilog or System Verilog or VHDL. In analog, it's much more complex today, and this is, I believe, because of lack of standardization here in terms of methodology. And the second point, what I believe is very important, you already mentioned that technology usually will stay proprietary or confidential. This is what we already encounter as a problem over the last years when starting to look into that. And also here, we need to find a smart way to separate this confidential layer, this PDK that usually stays with the Foundry, from the rest that you can then move open source or do whatever you want with that.
So actually, I mean, you hit on a without standards, so we can't collaborate. That's one of the most. There are implicit standards like SPICE when somebody represents a schematic, but there are standards. There's a need for more. Like for example, and I actually, because I was responsible for an IP development part of the company, we had to have standards internally. We were like 150 people developing so many IP blocks for different SoCs and different process technologies, all the way to 20 nanometer, as I mentioned back then in the year 2010. So we had to have standards to be able to test them, with confidence, and develop verification IP around them. And even we need to have the representation, the metrics of functionality, the smoke tests, for example, versus functional coverage versus parametric and statistical coverage of a given analog design. So the analog here, obviously, we all know if someone says that I designed an amplifier or an ADC, the next question is, if you really want it to be useful, oh, so what? Okay, is it statistically optimized? Is it, you start pushing the limits, and we all here, I believe, in this group would be not that foreign to that. So yes, standards are a must. I do, when you were talking this, I drew, and this is not going to work because of the blur, but I can remove it. When you were talking, so if you see that ladder, 130 nanometer is open, and then all the way to 12 nanometer is not open, we could actually have something like a staircase like this with parts are open and parts are not open. And then we can define that together. And also I will bring in our experience specifically for eFabless. We have obfuscated the PDK for those who don't want to open source it, that they want other people to use it without an NDA. So some of these things we can bring in, but absolutely. And that standard will become like a part of the, it would be published, it would be great.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think, so Christoph, thanks for your comments on this, and Mohammed as well. So I think having a standardized methodology that we can agree upon or develop and agree upon would be a great contribution to the analog community. I was chatting with a professor yesterday, actually, and so he had an interesting observation, which was this, is that, if you hand me a digital circuit, even something simple as a NAND gate, standard cell NAND gate, I'm likely to trust that, I take your word for it that it works. But if you hand me an analog circuit, like an operational amplifier, it's like, I'm not going to trust you at all. I'm going to have to verify the thing myself and make sure that it's going to work for my situation. So I think having a standardized approach, standardized metrics as to how these things are done would be beneficial. The other thought I would add is, and I don't know if this is possible because having worked for large companies myself many years and understanding some of the challenges, is that, if some of the different member companies could share some of their experience in or what their methodology is in analog, that would be maybe a good starting point to try to get towards a standardized approach. I don't know, that's just an idea.
Yeah, I agree. And eFabless will be the first, one of the first, at least. I mean, I will spare no effort in terms of the sharing what we think, what we experienced. And then obviously it's not, methodology there's no right or wrong, but there is assumptions, and then what you do with the assumptions and how you, so we can we should certainly do that.
Can I jump in? This is Sachin. Maybe I'll turn on my video. Basically, several of us are involved with DARPA programs, and there has been some effort to try and collect a bunch of benchmarks and so on. So some of that could potentially be reused over here. One of the sticking points is how much information you can release, and I think Mohammed talked about that to some extent. If you're working with Sky 130, there's basically no problem releasing anything. But realistically, if you look at where the tools are among this community right now, we are mostly looking at layout tools, whether it's David's tools or our tools or the Michigan tools, etc. If you look at basically going from the equivalent for open cores is going from RTL to a GDS, right? So we don't have a way of going to the RTL equivalent of analog all the way to GDS. If you can basically get a size netlist, for example, then you can go on from there, and that would be a reasonable place to start. So now the question is, what can you kind of release publicly? So during the discussions, in these DARPA programs, there was some nervousness even about releasing sized netlists because of nervousness about whether you can put out anything on GF12, for example, that's sized. So I think we'll have to overcome things like that. Sure. If it's Sky, that might be a reasonable place to start, and then take it from there.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think I'll bring to the table is the, I am personally involved in the circles in influencing other, I get the pleasure of that, you know, again, I haven't done anything specific to get that, but the circles of the foundries to see who's thinking about. So I'll tell you now for sure, definitively, there is a foundry that is going to release 1 or 2 processes within a year. Okay, another one. Okay. Well,
can you talk about what nodes?
They're early nodes. They're still in the early world, but it's a second foundry. And then the same foundry, I'm talking to them about the hybrid model, where how can the size net list, who's concerned? Is it the foundry, or is it the tool provider that was used? So all of that will factor in. I learned one thing: don't do something wrong that will ruin the vision by getting, you know, if you do something wrong, like there are people who take some IP. An example: the Skywater is not actually, it's a Cypress original seeded process technology. That's why it's a good process, because it was used in commercial products a lot. Skywater is a spin-off. Now they had to be done right, working with Cypress and company to be able to get that done legally, okay, and convince the right parties and address the right concerns. So I don't have anything. The only thing I can say is that the world is getting attention by the value of open source. You see the spikes of designs, and that would like to say that the more we emphasize and show success on the number of designs, the quality of designs in the context of 130 or the open processes, the more likely we're going to get to open advanced nodes. Okay.
Makes sense.
That's good to hear. I mean, in the end, I think we need a system that supports both ways, that you can do tape outs in open source PDKs, but you should also be able to do tape outs in proprietary PDKs. Because I mean, for Infineon, speaking for myself, today we don't use any open source PDK. So,
yeah.
But we would like to share the methods behind. Yeah.
Can I just say 30 seconds? I value everyone's opinions here, and I think we all need to work together as a collective effort towards what Mohammed is talking about, because I think we all have a vested interest in helping each other. And I know I'm very committed to helping everyone. And I think the more that we can help together, the better we will be as researchers, as well as collaborators. I think I know that we all have that at heart, but it's just something I feel strongly about, that open source movement that Mohammed's really leading, along with Tim Ansel. I think that's really important.
Thank you, James. Okay, so just because this is a mixed meeting, so Rob, on the agenda, what else did we?
Well, I think it's really the main thing, one was to introduce you, but then also to try to establish a roadmap or start working towards ideas for a roadmap. And that's what, part wanted to get some inputs. I appreciate Christoph's thoughts relative to from Infineon and methodology. And also Sachin's comments on, figure of merit type circuits and challenges involved there. I guess the other topic I had on there was to discuss to see if it would be possible. And again, this is probably an ongoing dialogue for a bit, but if it would be possible to establish a collaborative effort on some IP development with a goal of taping it out at some point.
Yeah. So my view of that is that I'd like to work. There are 2 ways of looking at this: is that see what we have and then advance it, what we have as a group, and also keep in mind where we want to go and see the directional alignment. So I would like to have two types of, I suggest that we have two types of approaches, two types of vantage points. One is that where do we want it to end? And then what do we have today and can actually put a strong statement. Like I'll tell you an example, and that's just an example. I'm not saying it's good or bad, or so I'm sure every other people here are very involved in different examples, and we'll have different views of that. Like for example, the FA SOC. Again, irrespective of the position on the FA SOC, there is a silicon that was put on MPW1, for example, for Google. When the silicon comes out and it gets measured and published, that is a good data point to support that. Now, it should be improved. Should it be a different process? Should it be, but that's a low-hanging fruit that actually can be done on Skywater, for example. That's an example. So if we look at all the members of this group and see what the group has and already spend energy on or focused on, and I'd like to get input on that, and because I don't remember everything, and also you guys have a lot of rich portfolio.
Thanks, Mohammed, for bringing up FA SOC. So we actually did a couple of tape outs in 65, Skywater 130, MPW1 and 2, and GF12. And we are currently measuring silicon on GF12. And we are expecting another silicon, which is going to come back around November or December. So we taped out different blocks, temp sensors, LDOs, PLLs, and DC-DC converters. Like right now, I'm measuring the DC-DC, and I'm reaching about 75% efficiency at like 1 milliamp, which is great, you know, for a generator. We use a fully digital flow, which uses place and route. And right now we are moving to open road. So, you know, this is, I mean, I'm pretty happy about the results. We are including Sachin's align tool to make the aux cells. If you guys remember how the FSOC flow work. Mm-hmm. But I just want to add to Mohammed's feedback.
Yeah, and so this is great. So now we're going to get into the question that Sachin brought. You know, are you going to be able to publish in details the 12 nanometer, where we're going to probably the 130 is going to happen? But I think everyone, and I have homework to do, so I can maybe individually with you to get that everyone has a low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. That is going to be useful in a building a relevant SOC, and we should, you know, basically start with that. So I would like to. I know we already started. Like Rob, we had the presentations. People were presenting what they're doing in different areas, but I'd like to maybe, as I said, I will come back and recalibrate on these presentations because I didn't attend a lot of them, and then also come and individually work, you know, or extract some information on what are potentially suggested low-hanging fruits like this in the different members of the group, and what else do we need from the world, industry or community.
Hey, Dan Fridgman from Berkeley here. Welcome, Mohammed. Welcome. I think it'd be a great fit with the group here.
Thank you.
I think echoing a lot of the comments so far, it sounds like there's some tension in what this group is for between kind of producing circuits, producing methodology, or what mix thereof. On the, what I think we're referring to as methodology front, I think the one element I would really point to is a medium of exchange for these circuits. So we've cited the trouble with that, particularly with the proprietary PDKs. And we've sort of pointed to the Halcyon open source, software industry as a better way. And I agree it's a better way, but I would point out that first, a couple of things. One, mostly open source software getting distributed in the world is generally happening through some structured packaging process, right? These servers like NPM and PyPy have figured out some schema for arranging these things, regardless of how they get produced, such that some program on the other end knows how to interpret them. We've had attempts at that. I think they've been more successful for the FPGA and digital space. And certainly within companies, there's something like this, right? It's usually just kind of a file layout thing. So I was at Apple from 2009 to 19. I can say firsthand, that's their quote unquote flow. I suspect some of the commentary from earlier was referring to something similar. So that ties into the notion you mentioned of abstracting away the proprietary stuff. Perhaps, Mohammed mentioned eFabless has something worth using there. If not, perhaps it's worth someone in this group developing. And then as far as the circuit content, I think that we're right to focus on kind of the broadest, most reusable building blocks first for putting this stuff into action. Now, we wouldn't necessarily be building whole chips. This is the analog working group. There won't be much more than sort of demos, but building them to the level that we can make something useful, whether it's for, kind of an IoT level processor type of chip or whatever other bigger application we can imagine them going into. So I think while, as on the academic front, we've got a lot of incentive to do kind of bleeding edge research, it is a little bit across purposes with making these sort of general purpose things. So perhaps the best approach then is, each of the institutions has kind of a novel tool chain and directing them towards some more of these more kind of mainline use cases is the best thrust of the gang here.
So I'll tell you an example. Thank you. I'll tell you an example that reinforces what you just said. So I'm just sharing a picture. So these chips here, these were chips that eFabless created with open source EDA, and the top two. This is the one in the top right is an ARM-based XFAB 180. This is Raven, which is RISC-V based 180. This is again RISC-V based 180. NEC, I mentioned commercially, was actually interested in Raven and Ravenna, which is still in 180, but they use it in a coprocessor. How I defined Raven, here's what I did. I just went and I said, okay, I need to send something. I need to send some data. And I came up with this within 5 minutes. And not that it's, magic, it's just a basic use case, okay, that has enough that was actually useful to a company like NEC for something, okay? They would do audio sampling, if in this case, and then they had a little bit of, we were able to put some key, authentication, and then, so we could, absolutely, the basic cases can go a long way with the low-hanging fruits, and then build on in more sophisticated cases as we go forward. Does this make sense?
So, certainly. Hi, it's Bora. Hi, welcome, Mohammed. I'm sorry I can't join at 8. So I joined a little shortly before 8:30. So Dan brought a very important point, something that we have been spending time on. Somewhat related to, and I don't know if it has been discussed, it is not just the PDKs that are proprietary, but the APIs into commercial CAD tools are also proprietary. And as far as I know, all of us are still relying on commercial EDA tools. That thing, when somebody says that the API is proprietary, that makes it really difficult to define this layer of sharing. Has there been any thought put into that other than, well, we are all just going to switch over to open source tools? Because open source tools are not at the level of what Cadence can do. And it will, eventually they'll get there, but I'm giving it, if there is a concerted effort, maybe a decade or more until we get there.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And this is why I actually said with or without automation. So we could both target the actual outcome and the automation to reach the outcome. So we could develop. There's no reason you couldn't develop something with a commercial tool that it would be, it's under like the stuff that's happening on the Google MPW. Some of that work has been designed with proprietary tools, but it will be open source. So
there is a, if you read the ULA
license
for a key install, that is clearly illegal.
So this is actually one of the,
Correct.
I guess, landmines that we have to navigate around. Navigate around.
Yeah.
Meaning,
So I mean, it's all fine if nobody gets sued, but there may be a takedown request.
Hey, Bora.
yeah. So I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, Mohammed and I chatted about this a little bit yesterday, actually, and I'm very familiar from my previous life at Oracle and Sun relative to some of the constraints in the EULA provided by our friendly EDA partners. Do you think that it would be possible to create an abstraction layer over some of these things to create, in other words, what I'm thinking here is create like a reference methodology flow using an abstract API that could then be instantiated to a particular target supplier, presuming that one had the necessary license agreements in place, or it could also target to an open source flow as well. But I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but or if we'd get in trouble with that too.
I think that's the right way of thinking, and I would love to see this community talk about that.
So one point to add here. I know it's a stretch, and I won't say that. The only thing I will say is that when I started the company, everybody was saying you will never be able to do anything with open source tools ever. So we did like Raven is a simple chip. It's not OMAP. It's not 100 million gigs, right? So we have to say that. But I am getting attention to say from companies to say, is there a way that open source design can help me in the EDA world, the EDA company like Synopsys or Cadence, or so there are discussions ongoing. Trust me, the world has changed when people did that. It started recently. People are thinking, how do I align my business with this wave that is gonna go? So I've heard stuff like this. I don't know where it's gonna land, but I heard it from the right people at the strategic level, saying, okay, how do we, and as EDA companies, benefit from the wave of open source design? Now that's obviously heard is somebody's telling me something, and nothing happens until it happens. But it's that would help over time, along with the abstraction, like Rob and Bora.
So let me ask some of our friends here from the commercial side. So I know in my earlier lives, and I'm sure this is true for all of you too, that you get EDA applications from all the major suppliers and some minor suppliers too. And we found in terms of developing different design flows, which have a life of their own, I think as all of us know, for better or worse, but that creating an abstract API, say for like place and route as an example, that it would allow us to switch between a IC compiler solution versus a Innovis solution. So has anyone done anything like that? Say like Infineon or Western Digital? I'm just curious.
Yes, so we are definitely looking into this, and especially since we think about joining this working group. I believe this is a prerequisite in the end to be successful, to have such an abstract layer that you don't run into legal issues, unless you get the EDA vendors into the boat and then they proactively contribute here with their APIs. But here I have no idea if this ever is going to happen.
Well, there's enough challenges having them collaborate in and of itself. I'm sorry, I stepped on somebody. Go ahead.
So Rob, we actually developed one here, and we're kind of like stuck. Well, we don't have a lawyer that we can really hire out to do that. So we've developed one with Python, and that can change between different texts. And then we've tried it with Innovis and it works. But maybe something that would help that would facilitate legal, kind of contacts or something that would help. Maybe Mohammed might be able to help with that too.
Yeah, and I think what I'd like to suggest is that we, as a group, this group has weight. Like different people have different strong reputation in doing things. So I think if you lose 100% of the shots you don't take. So let's take some shots and see what happens on these, starting with abstraction. When I went to XFAB in the first time ever, I said, I'd like to have your process run on our platform for anyone to design with it. He said, how? I said, I'll start with obfuscating the PDK. That was XFAB, not the EDA. And but that was the CEO, basically. He got it. And he says, well, if you're successful, then we sell more. So let's do it. So it depends on how, but I think the group here can articulate something that we can, through the collective network and the CHIPS Alliance, we can drive it home. But my recommendation is always, if you can hit silicon with a low-hanging fruit, please do it. Because every time you hit it, it's like an anchor on the mountain for the cliff, in my opinion.
Sorry, I lost internet for about 90 seconds. I'm back. So regarding that higher level intermediate layer, that's what we are doing with digital tools through Hammer. We still cannot publish how does that map to commercial tools. Although I'm seeing, there are plenty of GitHub repositories now that do contain that information, and they have not been as diligent with takedown requests that I've seen. I mean, this stuff has persisted for at least 6 months or so. We'll see how does that go. But it will be a good idea to engage also. I mean, besides this discussion, to at some point have a discussion with EDA vendors on, are things changing? I certainly plan to do that, for our work. So I don't want to engage and invest time into something that is going to face a takedown request, because Brian and I have been through those, and I can tell you they're unpleasant.
We have to factor in that experience, actually, and it'd be interesting to see what's publishable about that experience that we can talk about here.
Question I have for everyone, in terms of these tools, I don't know how FuseSock and Hammer compare, but would you call FuseSock is another instance of one of these intermediate layers for digital applications? Would you say that they are also surprisingly at risk of takedown requests because of their wrappers for other and their backends for proprietary tools? I'm just curious, like, exactly how does this differ? Because FuseSock does exactly what we're discussing here in terms of a wrapper around proprietary tools.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we published that. We used our labs. We're doing that. And we had a Synopsys asked us to remove that from public view. It was a long time ago. It was about 10 years ago or so, but that had to be all removed. For the experience, how the experience looks like, I haven't seen. I mean, that was a relatively pleasant, lawyer written letter. Please remove this. The TSMC letters are a little bit nastier. They come, as a breach of contract to the university president. Basically, this is a breach of contract, and the damages are unlimited. So let's talk about how do we settle this? I mean, you know, the
Yeah,
letter is,
so my philosophy for this, my own personal philosophy, what I applied in eFabless, the coalition of the willing. So I went to the CEO of XFab, willing, CEO. So there's a support. He, unless I basically change my word to him, he's not going to. The company has a contract now that has even the layers to be displayed. Is so the right level. TSMC is great company, but it's taking but it's taking an extreme on that part, and understandably why, because they're number one. So, but it's at the same time, I think it's a wrong strategy to continue to do that. I think the API openness would actually enable more sales of EDA. Like if you have a FuseSock or Hammer, and we told the shared examples of the EDA companies, if this is open source, that's going to make your tools shine.
So I'm wondering, I'm just
Completely
thinking here
agree.
about, so I'm sorry. The
yeah, go ahead.
So, you know, Siemens is a member of CHIPS Alliance. I used to work with their representative in earlier life and talk to them, their motivation. But I'm also wondering here if this is something maybe I could get some help from the Linux Foundation legal team in particular, because they have contacts with many different areas, but to see if we could start a dialogue on, you know, making it legal, so to speak, to at least have these APIs publicly visible. But I don't know if that's a fruitless endeavor, but it's just
I
a
think
thought.
I'd like to talk about this offline with the right people, maybe
Sure.
And Rob at least. And then when I say right, I'm sorry, at least since you voiced something here, because I think there is potential to actually, we are having conversations where the EDA companies are saying, how do I benefit from the open source movement that's already happening at the strategic level? I'm having these directly, so I can. However, I say conversations. I'm not going to claim I'm a magician or anything. Everything comes with persuasion, and the team here, I think there's enough merit that we can present it as a good for the business, and because it's good for their business. To be honest with you, when you have the APIs and people are, it becomes a really powerful way to show their power, their strength. Okay.
Hello.
So you have two approaches. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Two approaches. One.
Hello.
Yeah. Go ahead, Irina.
Sorry, Laura. I've been listening the whole conversation, but for me, it is more about, at least initially, I believe we need to set a reference point and see what are the cross sections, what are the common interests, not only what IPs we would like to develop. Because, for instance, for Kasim, open source PDK is really super important because he's working in that domain. And for us, as we are talking about like agnostic generators, at the end of the day, technology is not, I wouldn't say super open source like technology is not super important, but it is important. On the other hand, there is some drive from the industry, but there are also, already solutions from this DARPA initiative that it will be great if we can use it. And we cannot use it because there is no interface between us. So what I'm saying, in my opinion, as a strategic direction, it is important that we actually find this common point from which we can all develop, but also we can come back. So
and actually, yeah, so this is, thank you.
Side. Thanks.
Thank you. This is actually very interesting. And actually, if we don't we have to find that common point of interest. I just want to highlight one thing, just since you mentioned our interest in eFabless actually is indifferent about the PDK. We have proprietary PDKs on our platform, including advanced ones, but they're not publicized as much. And so I am, my own interest, well, there's a personal passion and outside eFabless, and there's the eFabless. eFabless is is agnostic to the process. They only, I'll say the same again. The Coalition of the Willing, we worked with the original, with the XFAB and the Global Foundries 130, for example, and Skywater, because that was a low-hanging fruit for us to make a point. And I have to say, I think eFabless cannot claim the success for itself. It's a village, takes a village, a big village to do that. And but it made the difference that we worked with what's willing. But just, Mariana, thank you for highlighting the point of, again, that applies to the low-hanging fruits. If we have look at the DARPA projects and see what is there, and then see the specific obstacles, and then we can address. I'm interested. I just want to clarify my position. It's not only about the open source PDK, but I agree with you 100% on, let's discuss the commonalities and try to tackle things that are low-hanging fruits, as well as
I'm sorry, Mohammed. I wouldn't say that these are low-hanging fruits. In my opinion, those are extremely important decisions that we need to take.
Okay.
You know, in finding that common point and the way how we should develop together from that common point. So basically, increasing this bubble of knowledge together. So,
would you suggest? Could I ask you? Let's have what's the process for us to do this, so that we can make the decision to share the information? Is it
probably everybody should kind of send you the topics they are interested in, and then we can discuss the cross sections. And you know, for instance, we have some experience in back 2, and we see some problems, some benefits, some drawbacks. I'm sure that Bora and people from UC Berkeley have also their own opinion, you know, what they would like to do and where they see that they can contribute.
So just, and I know this may be a good point to actually to conclude. Would it be possible that I create like an open a Google Doc, and then you can send me, but also it would be useful to have visibility for other people too, that we agreed like we'd have a half a page, or a page or a half a page, depending on what's efficient. I don't want to, that's an example for some of the interests to what Mariana was talking about. Would that be okay with everybody?
I mean, it will work. Then I will see what other people are working and what they find interesting, and who can we kind of connect and cooperate. I don't know.
My suggestion would be to think about, this is a good idea. Think in a direction of making something that looks like SI2, a parallel to SI2. And a parallel to open access. But I would love to hear other opinions to that. Okay, so we are at the top of the hour. Here's my action, my biggest action. I took some notes from this conversation, and obviously it's recorded, but it's and I will share a Google Doc for our topics as minutes, kind of the key topics were mentioned in this meeting, and then I'll share it with everybody on the call, as well as I would like to share another one where we can articulate the important points in what is you consider efficient. I don't want to squeeze and say half a page, but because it has enough information for other people to understand. That be okay?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for
thanks, Mohammed.
Welcoming me, and I'm looking forward to being a part of this group.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.